All right, welcome to everyone to my Duelmasters TCG sets 1 to 12 bombazar band IDC tournament related tier list. And at the very top, we are starting with Fire Nature Rush in the #1 position. What I think is the most strong deck, the strongest deck, the best deck. Very strong win rates, in my opinion. Very good matchup spread. Generally strong. People underestimate the deck against bad decks, I think, like my stats, personally. Playing against unranked decks, playing against crappy ranked decks, mid-range decks, poopy decks. Very, very high. 80+% win rate, 90%. It's insane. Like, I just crush these NOOB decks with Fire Nature Rush. One time in IDC, I played against some dude playing 60 card, Alcadius, Crazed Valkyrie, Model Light with some, like, water fucking blocker shit. I don't know, fucking whatever. I lost in 3 games. One time I lost to some jank like that. Most of the time, you don't face those decks. Like, it's like a misconception, bro. It's a misconception. Now, Fire Nature Rush, obviously, yes, people want to coast a little more. They play Fortress 4 bows. They beat those decks for free, right? They don't, and Rush is worse against those, but it's not bad against those on average. Like, you're still beating janky decks. Like, Rush is very strong. People underestimate it against the broad field. They think it's like maybe more anti-meta. It's not, it is more anti-meta, but it's like good. It's still good enough against crappy decks. And then against the winner's metagame, you're fucking golden, bro. Because now, why are you wanting to play like 50-50 mirrors against other like good players when you can play Fire Nature Rush and beat these fucking good players like 70% of the time? Not bad. It's a good exchange. But anyways, I think Fire Nature Rush is quite strong, very strong. The win rates with the deck are quite good. I think it's got like amongst like heavily played decks against ranked decks and cost stats. I think it has one of the highest win rates into the broader field. And then also when you look at like the stats of, I mean, I've done some analysis myself. Like, you look at myself, X-Boom, and Solomon, we played the deck probably the most, or we played the deck the most. You pull out our stats, which is a pretty good portion of like those stats. I think we collectively win probably about like, I think about 60-ish% of our games, which means like the broader field is winning like 50% of their games or so. Over something along those lines, and maybe sub 50%. So like in the hands of more experienced players or whatever, we're winning quite a good amount, and then the rest of the field is winning a substantially less amount. And like X-Boom in particular, his stats with the deck are as like an actual good player, not just like some dude that just spams Rush. And like Solomon is like, I don't know, for some reason his win rate's not as high, to be honest. I don't know, ladies, smoking too much weed, maybe get stressed out in high pressure situations. I don't know, bro. It could be any number of factors, but regardless, you pull out our big chunk of stats, and the broader win rate's not as good, which means, hey man, maybe Rush is like actually does take a little bit of like more skill to pilot consistently well in tournaments. Could be the case, man. Could be the case. Anyways, or maybe the meta game's just more favorable nowadays. And we're the ones that play the most nowadays. So I could see that being the case as well. But regardless, that just speaks to like how well positioned the deck is right now. Now, one of the other things interesting about those stats though, I mean, I'd be curious to know what those kinds of win rates look for people that like spam Fortress or Forbos in tournaments, because I could see like everyone kind of understands the idea that like there's a lower skill floor for Fire Nature Rush. So like maybe the spotter Fire Nature Rush player base is winning 50% of their games at the lower end of like the player pool. But like maybe for Fortress, that's like 40%. Like they're winning a lot less. And like the good players with Fortress are winning like 70% of their games or some crazy stuff like that. Whereas like the good players with like Fire Nature Rush are maybe only winning 60%. Or like X-Boom is like winning 62-63% of his games with Fire Nature Rush, right? So it could be that like the good players win more with decks like Fortress and Forbos, and the bad players win less with decks like Fortress and Forbos, which I think is an intuitive sense that a lot of people have. But maybe it's not the case. Maybe it's not the case. Like, I mean, looking at win rates, like people, like again, like people spamming, like noobs spamming Fire Nature Rush are performing stronger than good players spamming these supposedly very consistent, more consistent risk-averse type decks like Fortress and Forbos and stuff like that. So it's very interesting, lots of stats you could do. But I think Fire Nature Rush overall, I mean, it speaks for itself. Like, it's won so many of the last 2 tournaments, the last 2 IDCs, finals of the last CIDC. I punted one of the games, could have maybe won back-to-back CIDCs with Fire Nature Rush. Unfortunately, I did a very great disservice being a fucking noob, and unfortunately, it wasn't X-Boom playing against himself in the finals. Then before that, I mean, I won this IDC 2 before that, so that's 3 of the last 4 IDCs. And then going back even further, it won, I think, like 2 IDCs the season before. So it's very, 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 very strong. Yeah, quite strong. So anyways, moving on, we'll go to tier 1. Fortress. I mean, it's a control deck that shapes, these 2 decks really shape a lot of what other people's deck selection has been about. Fortress is like kind of the control that's on everyone's radar for how they select their control decks and aggro decks, and Rush is aggro deck on everyone's radar for how they select their aggro and Rush decks. And that shapes a lot of the downstream deck selection and positionings of the rest of the tier list. When it comes to, in particular, some of the aggro deck selection choices, I think, is like how 2-color aggros versus Rug versus Alzonius, like how those all kind of mesh out, is very much to do with like these 2 decks being, at least, it's kind of weird because it's like in terms of play rates, I think they are probably the most popular, but it could very easily change and switch. And then, so it's more of like mostly like a mental perception that these 2 are the decks that are targets #1 and 2. But yeah, Fortress, obviously, very, very strong. And some of the matchups that are maybe a little, could be tough sometimes, like they're made better by 40 cards potentially. Like I think just being hyper-focusing on the linear kind of progressions, because it is very much just a linear deck, and that's what makes the deck so strong, is it has these, there's like double ramp Lost Soul, double ramp Plague. Like that's a linear progression that beats a lot of decks, and it gives you this high floor. And it gives you game against like a lot of decks, like we'll cover later, like Survivors, like these engine decks like Survivors and Wave Strikers, for example. Like if those engines get online, like it can be difficult. But the problem is like the more consistent you make these Fortress decks to just like spam their like high roll draws, their engine based draws, Like they're just they can just very consistently win. But yeah, I don't know. It kind of remains to be seen where things fall on the 50 to 40 card spectrum. But Fortress obviously overall has been quite a decent deck, performing fairly well across a number of tournaments. But the biggest problem is it loses a lot to Fire Nature Rush. I think probably a 70-30 matchup-ish. Could be slightly better for Fire Nature Rush, maybe slightly worse. Very, very die roll dependent though in my experience so far. Or maybe not. Yeah, I mean die roll matters a lot. It's very play draw dependent regardless. But I think yeah, but overall like Fire Nature Rush is like still winning. Like yeah, I mean once the die is cast, maybe like it's a huge fluctuation, but you're still like favored overall no matter what the case, and on average probably 70-30 I would suspect. But yeah, I think it's very clear that in most people's minds these are like the two decks to beat, and both like kind of linear decks that put a downward pressure on everyone's curves. I think for a lot of the aggro decks especially, like it just forces everyone to be kind of more linear in a sense themselves, which is maybe not the most fun for the metagame. It pushes out a lot of like more interesting stuff. I don't know. Hydro Hurricane is obviously, maybe not obviously, it's tier 1 I think. Favorite against Fire Nature Rush, I'm sure, like to some degree. I don't know to what degree per se. I haven't played a lot against it with Fire Nature Rush in tournaments, but I think it's pretty good. It's like unfavored though against Fortress. Not sure by how much, but yeah, it's just decent. It just feels finicky. Like it's a finicky deck. It plays a weird glut of stuff like 4 to 5 mana. All the Gigazald and Ice Uber stuff are basically just to like make sure your Misrios survive. Like it just clears away from Misrios, and it still always comes down to just like whether you find the Misrios or how many Misrios you find at the end of the day. And I find it to be a kind of finicky deck. It's like not necessarily linear in the same way as like Fortress's draws or like Fire Nature Rushes, but it's still very much just like an odds deck. I feel like you just have so many draws that are just kind of ass. But then so many draws that like you're just like unlocked by just finding the right mix of cards. So I don't know, maybe that fakiness like makes it a little bit worse into like the broader field, but it still performs pretty consistently well. So I don't know. I think it's like overall pretty proven decent deck. Fortress or Forbos. I think honestly I really like Forbos still. I think I feel like it's better positioned as well. It's like weird because, like I said earlier, most of the decks are picked with the idea of like Fortress and Fire Nature Rush are like the two decks to beat, and that's why like the Sphere of Fortress is what holds back Forbos. But the thing is like Forbos right now does with people adapting to these two decks and picking more like aggro decks like Water Fire, Water Darkness, like those decks have been seeing more success recently. With those two decks at the forefront are coming to more prominence. Like Forbos is better positioned against those than probably Fortress is, and it's better positioned against Fire Nature Rush than Fortress is. Against Hydro Hurricane, I'm not sure if it's as good or about the same or slightly more favored. Like I just feel like Forbos still has quite a strong matchup spread. It's just like you're afraid of Fortress mainly. But what's kind of interesting too, or kind of funny, is that a lot of the people that could play Forbos are the ones playing like Fortress Burn. So if they all just switch to Forbos, then there's no Fortress Burn to worry about. It's kind of funny, but yeah, I don't know. It's like that's just maybe just like a weird dynamic of the IDC metagame player base. But yeah, I think like all three of these decks are pretty strong. I still like Forbos as a deck. I feel like it's often like a decent pick, but like in CIDC, it's maybe not as much because like you look at that, like a lot of the players just like fear Forbos, fear the top end, and then or fear Fortress, sorry, and then no one's gonna pick Forbos into that kind of metagame. But I don't know. In IDC, I just think like it's still does quite a good job of like being good against like the broader field of like random jank, and then it's just like actually like the only top tier deck you're really worried about is Fortress. I feel maybe you're worse against Survivor, like the newer Survivors. I can see that maybe than Fortress Burn. Yeah, interesting. I guess this also includes like the Rebirth list, which I have less experience playing with, and I think a lot of the Rebirth lists though that you run into, because like there was a period where like Spalding and Solomon even were playing these like Rebirth control lists. They were very similar to Forbos, I think, and I think Forbos even adopted a lot of that technology, and it's like they're almost like somewhat of a hybrid, with like a move towards more Rebirths these days. But a lot of the Rebirth lists you run into now are just like a bit jankier, like these bigger giant piles, more haphazard card choices, less refined, more like often like involve like Misrios and just weirder big like high roll engine piles, like very American. But yeah, I don't have less respect for those decks personally. Deck out is I think quite strong. I guess the biggest fear is a Fortress. I guess like it's again similar to Forbos. Maybe it's better against Fire Nature Rush than most of these decks. Probably worse than Hydro Hurricane against Fire Nature Rush. I know from my perspective, against Fire Nature Rush, I've played against deck out a fair number of times, and I have a slight favorite matchup spread, or slight favorite in games and match rate. And I've lost a lot of die rolls as well, which is I think I've played it like 10 times and lost like 8 dice or something like that. Like I've something along those lines. Like I've just lost a lot of die rolls against deck out in IDC. So like that definitely biases the results a bit that I've had. But still, I think the deck is like quite decent. And the problem is like there's just a huge spread of variance. Like if you play against Defindo, you're gonna have a different time than you play against Mr. Bazat, and you're gonna have a different time if you play against like Alex Wynn, for example. Like you're just all these lists vary to different degrees, so it's kind of hard to get like a specific sense. But I've enjoyed playing the deck when I have. I think it's decent. I don't know if I know like the Fortress matchup dictated is unwinnable. I think you have a higher floor than that with particular versions. Like you still have like the chance of like double ramp, or they draw slow draw, and then you have like Lost Soul, and then upheaval is like a really, really crucial part of that whole puzzle that I think gives you a good game. But I don't know how big that floor is, like how, or like you have a ceiling that's like quite decent, like when you a fair chunk of games. I just don't know how big that chunk really is. If it's defendable, like I know when I played the deck, like I've won a fair amount against Fortress Burn, but I haven't played that much, and I mostly play against Solomon when he's high. So most of my testing just doesn't, or it's not really testing, it's just like playing games for fun. So there's not much weight to be put behind it. So anyways, but I still overall quite like the deck. I think it's like just really solid. I just don't know if it's like as good as Forbos against a wide field. I don't know if it's like as good as like Fortress, where it's like more linear and like proactive and just like solid against everything except for Fire Nature Rush. So anyways, yeah, I just find the deck to be quite strong and kind of like, I don't know if gatekeep is the right word, because I think it's like a good game against Hydra Hurricane, like good enough game against Rush, like better than most decks against Rush. So I quite like the deck. Then we have Spalding, or not Spalding, X-Boom, two goats of the game, mix them up. But we have X-Boom's Light Dark Nature. This deck definitely suffers from the opposite problem as Fire Nature Rush, where if someone wins with Fire Nature Rush, it's the deck that won, not the player. With Light Dark Nature, it's very much people look at the results as those of X-Boom, not of the deck itself, which is maybe disservice to the deck, maybe not. It's hard to say. I think most people look at it and see kind of a clunky pile, because it's very similar to Hydra Hurricane in structure, actually, where it's got this glut of like mid-rangey, thready kind of cards, like 4 and 5 drops, like Camellia, Trova, Ice Vapor, Mysterios, etc. Like it's got this big kind of threat package and stuff that looks clunky, but unlike Hydra Hurricane, you have a huge pile of 3-mana ramp cards to smooth that out. Obviously, you also have Skysword, so there's like a huge glut of 5 drops and stuff like that, but I think it's much better against like Fire Nature Rush than like Fortress and even Forbos. I don't know if it's a huge favorite. It's probably somewhere between like Fortress or Forbos and Hydra Hurricane in terms of its matchup win rate against Fire Nature Rush, but it could be closer to Hydra Hurricane, actually. Hard to say exactly, but I think the deck is like particularly impressive, and like you mostly have to just take X-Boom at his word when he says that it's like favored against Fortress, and that it seems like still decently applicable, but you just worry that it has that kind of Hydra Hurricane, like again, like that kind of clunkiness to it, the fragility that like maybe it's just like not as consistently, doesn't have as like concise and like clean of an engine as Fortress does for combating like just like the lower tier-ish type decks. Because you're playing more finicky cards, which leaves you more vulnerable to just like awkward draws or just like being picked apart when you just draw the wrong mix of stuff against lower tier decks. But I think it's like, and overall, like it also particularly struggles a bit more than Forbos against like some of the water fire or like the Paladin decks. I think like I know X-Boom stats, they aren't super deep, but I feel like the results of this deck it's a pretty shallow pool of actual results. Like they're not that many matches, but I feel like it's kind of struggles more with those like 2-color Paladin aggros than some of these other decks like Deck Out or Forbos. So that's like kind of a drawback of the deck. But I think overall it's like pretty impressive. X-Boom's results with the deck have been very consistent, but then X-Boom's results with pretty much everything that wasn't like Starnoid in the early, when he was first joining IDCs, like has been pretty consistent. So like he does well with everything that's not Starnoid, basically, is what I gather. But at the same time, I mean, like you can't necessarily, like you still can't do well with something against Starnoid, so it has to be doing something right. But yeah, I think the deck is like pretty good. It's scary, one of the scarier decks, like when you, like, but that's the thing so insane about Fire Nature Rush, is you get paired against something that's like got a 55% edge against you, and you're thinking it's like the end of the world, which again speaks to how OP this deck is. But yeah, I think it's particularly good, but it just has to be proven in the hands of more players than just X-Boom. Next up, we have 2-color aggro. I guess this is Water Dark and Water Fire. I personally would separate out Water Nature because I think it's less proven, but probably similar in strength. I guess I'd put this in 1.5. I feel like these are like these are all kind of like tier 2 decks, but they just like deserve a little bit of a mention. Like they're closer to tier 2 than tier 1, in my opinion, but they deserve like a little bit of a mention to be separated from tier 2, distinct, because of like the results they have, in my opinion. I think that's what separates them. Is like they feel like tier 2 quality decks, but they have the results that dictate like differentiation. Whereas like Rug, for example, I feel like it's a tier 2 quality deck. It just has like no results in the last like fucking cycle or two. So yeah, I think 2-color aggro is quite strong, and again, the product of like Fortress and Fire Nature Rush, because like Rug is decent, right? Like it's a decent deck, but these decks are probably better against, or these decks are way better against Fire Nature Rush, and then like compared to something like Alzonius, the lower curve is more important for combating a deck like Fortress. If you cared more about Forbos, that was a reason why like Alzonius and Rug would be better picks than this kind of deck. But I think all of them are just like worse than Rush for the most part. I personally prefer Water Fire, but I think these decks are quite good. They're also better than Rush against a Hydra Hurricane. So they're just very solid, consistent decks. And as long as you build them like anti-control enough, they can be good. I just like worry that I don't know what their matchup spreads are quite like against Deck Out. I feel like Water Darkness has like the upside of like Spin Slicer being a very strong card as long as they don't find their like Terror Pits. Yeah, I think they're just really solid, like decent aggro decks. I think they're like the 2 best performing aggro decks that aren't Rush in the recent while. So yeah, again, personally, I slightly prefer Water Fire, but I have a respect for both of them. Next up, I will put this in tier 2, even though maybe that argument for Survivor should be like, because it has had results. I'll just put it here, whatever. Maybe that's what I should say. Close. tier 2, but with results. Because I think that's like kind of what the gist of this is. Like they're like approaching tier 1 because of based on results, but like they feel like they're tier 2 quality decks. So anyways, I think yeah, Survivor's been performing quite well. Now Fire Deck Nature Survivor I think is like tier 3, no lie. I think it's like much sketchier into like the newer Fortress builds that have become more linear, and like they're just gonna beat your engine a decent amount of time, like these mana burn decks. And then like the grindier stuff is just like less popular. So like I just think like the Fire Dark Nature stuff is tough. It's tough. But like you're good against that stuff. And then your engine stuff, it's like the problem is you're still so bad against Rush. Like I feel like the Sky Sword stuff though, like it doesn't solve the Rush matchup. Like the old Survivor, like Fire Dark Nature, even with like 4 burst shots and even like you play Meltdown and stuff like that, like your deck is still getting absolutely demolished by Rush, like 80-20 plus, like maybe 90-10. Whereas with Sky Swords, you're raising the floor a bit, but you're still like 75-25, right? You're still awful matchup. But like the Sky Swords help a lot with the other aggro, like the lesser aggro's than Rush, like the Water Fires, so the Water Darks, the Rugs of the world, the Water Natures, all those like random other aggro decks, like the older Survivor could have trouble with even those. Whereas Sky Swords, like you just adapt this like Fire Dark Light Nature, good stuff, kind of engine incorporated into the Survivor package, and that definitely raises your floor against like the broader metagame, I think, when you incorporate all these other aggro decks, and you're able to still kind of hold on to that like general like strong engine. So I think the Fire Dark Light Nature just definitely shores up some of the weaknesses, but you're still not solving you're not super meaningfully changing how it fits into like you're just making it a more viable deck into a broader field, but you're still just like have the biggest weakness of like getting destroyed by Fire Nature Rush, in my opinion. But it's still quite strong. I think, yeah, I think this is like a fine spot for it. Still a fine spot. I think it's got a little bit of like clunkiness issues sometimes, but overall performs pretty well. Alzonius, yeah, this deck doesn't perform that much. It's like okay though. It's a decent deck, good deck. Anti-aggro, aggro effectively, but it's like bad against like most of the Sky Swap stuff. I don't know if it's like bad against Hydro Hurricane. Probably decent against like Ruby. I just think it's like right now, just because it's like not as good against Sky Swap, or like Fortress specifically, like if there was more emphasis on Forbos, it might be a bit of a better position deck than the Water Darks, but because, and still like countering Fire Nature Rush, but because right now Fortress is like the prominent threat in people's eyes, I think that's what makes like these 2-color aggro decks more positioned in the metagame than Alzonius. But Alzonius might be like better against like jankier mid-rangey piles than these 2-color aggros, 2-color water aggros might be. So I could definitely see an argument for Alzonius still being solidly positioned, but I just think there's like, I don't know, I just don't love the deck. I just feel like it's got this like mediocreness to it that's just like, it's just like slow aggro that's just like kind of a little too mid-rangey for my taste these days. So I don't know, I'm not as big a fan. Rug, I think it's similar arguments. It's just so much worse than like Rush against Rush to justify over some of these other aggro decks. Like it's decent enough against like Fortress and Forbos, I think, but I think it's like still worse against both those decks and Fire Nature. So it's mostly just like bad Fire Nature, because like I also think it's like, I don't know if it's like necessarily meaningfully better than Fire Nature as well. Like Fire Nature is not even that bad. Like I think it's way overstated how bad Fire Nature is versus Alzonius, and even against like these 2-color decks. Rug is also similar. It might even be just like worse against Alzonius than Fire Nature is. So I think it's just, yeah, I don't know. I just personally don't love Rug. I think it's just like not as good as Sky Swap against the Sky Swap decks people want to believe. It's much better against stuff like Deck Out, I guess. But even then, like Fire Nature Rush is still beating like Deck Outs. So yeah, it's definitely better against Hydro Hurricane too. But there's also like similar to Alzonius, there's just like a mediocreness like to playing like these like clunky slow aggros or like 3-color aggros. Like they're just taking on more risk when you play these like bigger mixes of things, like less consistent clean engines. Like there is just like an inherent downside to doing that just like lowers the deck's overall strength a little bit. I just don't like 3-color aggros that much personally. Grange, I guess the mana burn deck, like maybe we could just talk about Turbo Burn because it's not really on here, I don't think. Like Turbo Burn I think is like whatever, 2.53, whatever, who cares. Grange, I like that deck. I think it's decent against Fortress. Probably gets worse the leaner the Fortress decks are, but I like that deck against Fortress. Can definitely struggle with burst shot type decks, like mass removal type decks, like Deck Out, Fortress, or Forbos can be hard. I think it's decent against Hydro Hurricane. The problem is just so bad against Rush. It's not as bad against like other slower aggros. Very fun to play. It's probably like similar in strength to Rug aggro though. Like Rug's better against Rush than Rug is. And so I don't really know. I'm going to say this might just be like, it's a way more fun to play deck than Rug, but it's also maybe it just ends up being bad Rug. I could see a world where that's the case, which is kind of embarrassing, but it's probably got its own like quirks. Like it's maybe better against like decks like X-Booms, or I don't know. I don't really know. Maybe better against Hydro Hurricanes, worse against Deck Out, worse against Survivor. It's probably maybe even worse being like 2.5, but I like the deck, so I'm going to leave it there. Water Nature could be better than Rug right now. I just feel like for some reason, to me, unlike Water Dark and Water Fire, I feel like this is just like bad Fire Nature Rush, because I think it's I don't really think it has an edge against Fire Nature Rush, unlike these decks do. And I also think it's like worse against like everything else than Fire Nature Rush. Like I don't know what to me this deck just feels the most distinctly like just bad FN Rush of all these 2-color aggro's. Just from my experience playing with it, I think it's still a decent deck overall. Could be better position right now than even Rug. Maybe not. Probably. Maybe it could be. I think it's probably worse against this. Maybe about the same or better against this. Worse against this. Worse or better against this. Worse against it. Yeah, probably similar. It's about this quality. Decent deck. Now the rest of these decks. This deck I have no cool Life Fire Nature aggro. It's like solid, but I don't give a crap about Luki LX. The mana base like 3-color. It's like 3-color aggro like Rug. Like when I was mentioning the problems, I just don't like 3-color aggros. Trying to balance like Luki LX and Ganta is like even worse. It's even worse. So like the same issues but worse. And I just don't think the deck's like who cares. There's a bunch of different ways to play it. I know people have like experimented with like dragons, even like Dragalzars and Kokalupias and stuff like that. Kind of cool, but whatever. Just who cares? Who cares? Maybe the more mid-range builds that like I think like Pablo or someone maybe used. I forget. Maybe those have some merit. I don't know. Don't really care. It's like borderline what the fuck tier. I don't really know. Bonanza. I'll put this in what the fuck tier. Like I don't know. There's some fun stuff, but it's funny that I just like don't even know if it's even that good against Fortress. Like maybe you're like trying to counter them with Bonanza, but the problem is like again your deck is just like bricky as hell. Fortress just like linearly has those like linear draws that just beat your ass anyways. Yeah, whatever, who cares? Arbalade's also trash. Like this deck maybe was more appealing back in the older time when like every deck was just like trying to grind. Like back in a time when Zombie Carnival was like a god card of like late game recovery. Maybe that's a world where like you're Simian Trooper grashing in a positive way. But we do not live in that world anymore. Like Fortress is just bouncing your mana shit. You're doing nothing. It's trash. And you're getting smoked by Rush. This is Lightwater Nature Tribal. Okay, so there's 2 versions. Like whatever like American type of shit you got going on with like merfolks and crap, like just garbage file. American Lightwater Natures are like tier 3, whatever. Who cares? Alcadias, Lightwater Nature Alzonius. I haven't played much with, but like Alcadias, let's just rank Alcadias. Like I feel like that's a deck that's actually worth ranking. I think it's like kind of matchup dependent. It's got yeah, I don't know. It's like similar to Wave Striker almost in a sense in its matchup spread, except better against Fire Nature Rush. I kind of get that sense. Like really crappy against fire removal, but like more specifically like sweepers. You're not as bad you're not as bad as Wave Striker against stuff like Volcano Charger. Like obviously getting Volcano Charger on your reasserts, but like the rest of your stuff is like Hulkus and Bats. Whereas like getting Volcano Chargers as like when you're trying to get your Wave Strikers online is like devastating. So it's like I think the Alcadius deck is a little bit more specifically weak to like the sweeper spells, but then like all these fire decks play all of that. So it's like harder against like certain controls. I think it's like in decent deck. I think it's decent deck. Obviously did well in the hands of like Halfar, but similar in argument to like Exum's deck, where it's mostly just played by Halfar who had success with it. Yeah, I don't know. Then Halfar's like one of the better players of IDC history, so it's more like Halfar gets the credit. It's one of those situations where Halfar gets the credit and not so much the deck. But I think people have a decent understanding of like where its matchups are good. I just don't know if you're like super confident going into a wide field in IDC with this kind of deck. Maybe it deserves to be like tier 2, but I feel like it's just like still a bit unproven. But I think yeah, it's decent. Starnoid is I don't even know. I don't even know what this is. Hydrus also don't care. This is like Life Fire Nature is like very similar to like I don't care tier. Do not janky 3-color mid-rangey aggro stuff. Who cares? I think Rub still deserves a slight better look than these decks. Like I think it's still like Rub control mid-range. I think Rub mid-range is just bad. Rub range style, but I think Rub control is probably whatever. Maybe it deserves to be lower than Alcadius, but yeah, I don't mind it. I think Rub is still like solid stuff, solid deck, and just like kind of bad versus everything, but like maybe decent against some of these certain builds of Rub can be decently positioned against like some of these. I just feel like you have like no good matchups against like anything. Maybe you beat Alcadius probably. Like very little in the way of good matchups, got maybe like Water Darkness. You could have builds of Rub that are good against Water Darkness, maybe slightly favored against, probably not, about 50-50 free smash. This deck, Wave Strikers, kind of like I said, it's very similar to Alcadius, except Wave Striker could be better against Fortress Bear. Some draws, more consistently good against Fortress. I could see it, I had decent results, but then the problem is like the 40 card builds of Fortress, again, that linear plan is like much better against Wave Strikers. Much more important, just like Double Ramp Plague is too fast for Wave Striker very often. On the play at least. Wave Striker's decent against some of these aggro decks when you can get CP on Dark Online, probably worse against like the water versions, really bad against Fire Nature Rush. I just think it's like a bit too disjointed, too awkward, and I don't know what it's really super countering other than just like jankier aggros, like slow aggros, mid-rangey stuff, like clunky stuff, and then Fortress. It's just like a solid engine deck, but it's just like a bit too inconsistent and very weak to fire, similar to like Alcadius, except Alcadius is like better against like the aggro decks because you just abuse like the Sky Swap stuff, shield triggers, yeah. Very similar to Ice Sword as well, which I would maybe put here. I just don't really like this deck. I don't think it's as good against Fire Nature Rush as people say it is. I just like if people have said like counters Fire Nature Rush, counters Fortress, but I don't know if it counters Fire Nature Rush that hard. To be honest, could be bad against it. Like slightly out of favor. I can see it. I can see it. Maybe not though. Maybe it's decent. It's like better against slower aggros potentially. But Searing Wave could be a problem just like for Alpha Diaz. So maybe Rut's better. Yeah, interesting. I think it's like a solid deck, but it's like again similar to Alpha Diaz and Wave Strikers. It's just like there's so many like random piles of like fire-based like decks nowadays. Like Rebirth, there's so many random people playing like Rebirth piles and like fire controls, and those are still quite popular. And I feel like you just have like a hard time into just like a broader field with these kinds of decks that are really, really weak to certain styles of cards. And then like these decks have the upside, like Ice Sword and Alpha Diaz have the upside of maybe being slightly better against Fire Nature Rush. And then decent against Fortress. But I think like Wave Striker is probably better against Hydro Hurricane. Yeah, they all have maybe slight. It's kind of hard to say exactly what their slight upsides and downsides are, but they're all kind of similar strength with similar weaknesses. And then Rub I think is like the best of just like the janky ass, like old school American decks. So I guess that's kind of where I end on all this stuff. Sounds right. Yeah, looks good to me.